Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Free Lunch. It is a pleasure to be on this podcast and to be sharing thoughts with you this week. And I'm joined by the one and only Mr. Kenny G. Ken, salimia wananchi, say hi to the people.
Hi everyone, great to be here again. Looking forward to another good discussion this week.
Excellent, excellent. Ken, how was your week and what was interesting and different for you this week?
Wow, that's a very insightful question. I mean, it's still midweek, so I guess it's still half the week to work through. But I think so far, it's really looking at, I saw the Mitumba traders having massive demonstrations this morning in Nakuru.
Oh no.
And really they're saying that they have run out of stock. If these things continue, as the ban continues as it is, they are going to face starvation. And just really empathized, and we really wanted the CS in terms of, I don't know who's the CS in charge of it, I think of trade, to really look into it. And I think that's definitely an area one day we should think about.
Okay. I totally agree. We may have slightly covered it in MSMEs, but I think this is a pure informal sector. So I think really it does deserve an episode, given that they play a humongous role in supporting value chains, in trade, etc. I think for me the interest.
How about you?
Yeah, no, this week was awash with different bits, different things that came up. I think the one that was super salient for me is the fact that, and we may have alluded to this in previous episodes, the fact that Kenyans, the burden of paying for COVID-19 insurance-related bills in hospitals is piling up on Kenyans. So, folks are beginning to feel the squeeze there. And, more related to our topic of the day is this idea that, on the one hand, the pausing of the education curriculum for 2020, the cancellation of this academic year calendar, certainly has disrupted the lives and for millions of children across the country and their parents and families. But what stood out this week was the TSC setting guidelines for how people should study in the villages and how teachers should help pave way for that, as well as private schools looking to receive about $770 million from the government to support them wade through the crisis, especially with the school closures, in the education system closures in place. So those are the two things that sort of jumped in my mind this week as things unfolded in the media and in the general economy.
I mean, that part on education is something I know you and I are very passionate about. And for me, it particularly aches me because when you ask ourselves, what is education?
Right.
At a very fundamental level.
Right.
And you and I went to liberal arts colleges that really emphasized broad thinking and interdisciplinary approach to solving problems. But the one biggest disappointment in how I feel COVID has played out in the world, I didn't feel that interdisciplinary approach really coming in. And it's only right now I'm seeing people are starting to understand that this is COVID-19 has created such a multi-layer challenge that we need to have input from so many areas. And for me, it really worries me because, I would have expected at the very beginning for people to appreciate that. And so whether you look at healthcare or education or business or the economy, I see a lot of commentators and pundits really trying to put it as if it's one against the other. And really people are realizing that these things are far, far deeper interconnected. And we have to be very, very critical in how we do it. For me, I almost feel let down by how we have approached COVID-19, because the decisions we've made right now will have lifelong effects, on people. And I only feel that appreciation will come much later.
You're totally right. I think part of the problem is that right from the beginning of the crisis, so back in March, I think the way the issues were being framed is that it's a lives versus livelihoods problem. So COVID is presenting these two distinct, clear options, and policymakers, pundits, governments, presidents have to pick one. You either pick to save lives or you pick to restore and maintain livelihoods. And I think that already was the wrong framing. I think the conversations, the decisions we were making really should have had lives and livelihoods together. So we should have been saying, how do we prevent loss of life? And how do we restore and maintain, and maybe even improve livelihood, so that both of these conversations are being weighed in, or at least are finding space in the argument? Because you're absolutely right. I think what we did is we picked one side, focused on that side, then realized, oh, that is having problems on livelihoods, then switched back to livelihoods. And all these disruptive activities, will inevitably eat into the economy, eat into our growth, affect our children. In July, the Kenyan government and the education ministry in particular made history when they canceled the 2020 academic calendar. And, that was in the backdrop of other East African countries, for example, like in Tanzania, where they said, no, at the end of June, we'll resume schooling. And, it's almost, I don't want to say it's made us, a very curious case, but certainly when Kenya showed up the week before in the New York Times, and the title of the article was Kenya's unique solution to the school problem: cancel the year and start over. It's just going to show how these decisions, of course, they're not easy to make. So it's easy. Let's not throw stones at a glass house, but there should have been at least a little bit more consultation. And because canceling an academic calendar has humongous ramifications for the sector. So if you think of quite pragmatically, the 2 million candidates who are going to be forced to repeat their final year exams, when you think of all the other students who are going to be demoralized, plus their families, plus teachers, because they're not able to continue with normal schooling. When you think of the fact that the public sector teachers would still get paid, and I believe there may have been a piece in the media more recently of the national organizational body that's looking at teachers having been successful in salary negotiations, so they may be getting a salary increment, whereas their private sector colleagues are either looking at being out of jobs or having to look at other ways of sustaining their livelihoods. It's been a colossal decision and disaster. I think one that the ministry has tried to walk back away from, in saying, we have no interest in keeping our kids at home, and if the situation improves before January next year, we are happy to look at sending kids back. But yeah, I think we really should have spent a little bit more time in consultation, because canceling an academic year beyond just educational activity is livelihoods, but also just addressing inequality. So all of a sudden, the richer families can continue their education, but maybe through online learning or through tuition. But for the poorer families, it remains to be seen whether they'll be able to take advantage of any of the government initiatives. And already there's been instances and evidence shown that even digital learning hasn't had the effects that it was meant to have. Ken, what are your thoughts?
No, I think that article on the New York Times, I think, was a very important piece. And even before we get deeper into it, there was another op-ed on the Sunday Standard by one pundit who was talking about the 1982 coup that happened in Kenya and the academic year that was lost then.
Yeah.
And he was making the case that loss of that academic year, 1982, has had lifelong. Now we are talking almost 40 years later.
Oh man, yeah.
Almost 40 years later, and he said that lost year has had a lifelong impact on that. And that was on the Standard. Now you bring in the New York Times, which really builds on the same and adds more tentacles around inequality and such things.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, it really worries me because yes, we'll get a vaccine, we'll move away from COVID one day, but our ability to problem solve, did we waste so much money in college? Because I thought college life was supposed to give us all the tools to be able to make good decisions. But for me, the unidimensional approach we've seen, not just in Kenya, but in many countries, even what you said about lives and livelihoods, that wasn't the original position. That came almost 2 months into COVID. That I started hearing about that phrase around late April, early May. Before that, it was, everybody just staying,
right.
And that. So even that lives and livelihoods, it evolved. It came almost 2 months in, and now this is a point where it's now taken a whole new lifelong. I mean, this debate has been playing out in the UK because the UK on Monday made the decision that all kids will go back to school in September. They've already made that decision, and they've said that there is no evidence to suggest that there is high levels of transmission within schools, and I'm like, okay, that's great news, but before you got there, how much damage
exactly
has been done. And yes, even the UK, they are going to launch a formal inquiry into how COVID was handled. And I love that, and I feel all countries need to do the same thing.
Correct.
Just have a formal, because there are many other issues. We've heard about the corona billionaires here in Kenya. There are many other issues that have come up, and I love how the UK said there has to be an independent inquiry into how COVID was handled, both positively and negatively, because pandemics will always be here. Coronaviruses, there are so many coronaviruses out there.
Right.
I don't think people realize it's a whole family of viruses. So there's nothing to say that in 2030 there won't be another COVID 2030,
Exactly, right? Or COVID 2029, depending.
Exactly. So for me, I think we really need to really come together as a society and say, did we use all the toolkits as a society to solve this problem? And how can in the future, because the past is the past, what's broken is broken, how can we apply this better in the future? If that happens, I think that might be the one silver lining.
Correct. If we can learn from this crisis and be better off from it. And, you talked about some very interesting points here. So on the one hand, I totally agree with you that the disruptions of schooling will have lifelong effects. And when I think about what is actually being achieved in schooling, so in the US, they are also having this argument of, hey, let's resume schooling in September, because schooling is a lot more than just educational attainment. It's the place where kids who cannot afford 3 square meals a day can at least come and have 2 or 2.5 meals, right? It's also an environment in which we can detect if there's violence in the home and make sure that children in those environments can be removed. So if you even just take those two pieces and think about school feeding programs, think about preventing violence against children in homes, and then extend that a little bit by saying, if you can keep kids in school, then that helps them stay away from potentially sliding or falling victims to early childhood marriage, or getting disillusioned from education and being lured into other things. If we then all of a sudden keep kids at home for longer than they should, there's going to be a lifelong transformative effect on a young girl's educational income potential and attainment if she gets married off too early because she couldn't continue on with her schooling, or for example, if her parents gave up on education and said, you know what, this I don't even have money to continue on with your schooling, so just sit at home until I have money, and then the young people sort of get discouraged and demoralized. Or if even cases of violence against children go unreported, and so you have situations where children are living in very dramatic and violent environments, or if they can't get sufficient education access to food, that compromises not only their life now but their future occupational and educational attainment, right? So it's just worrying, how education is so central, and the fact that we've canceled it just speaks to potential problems down the road. And sadly, even the compromise solutions of, hey, let's try and pick up learning through villages, that is unclear. It's very unclear as well whether that will actually solve some of those problems, because in those villages, will somebody cook for these children? In these villages, will there be support to report violence? Super unclear. And then how, if the idea was to keep kids safe and not keep them in schools, wouldn't there just be so much crowding in the village, and that could potentially undo the gains? And then what happens thereafter? Are we saying that, does that undermine the schooling system? Because I'm not sure in a village you're going to have an organized 8 to 9 a.m. is math followed by English. Is it just going to be some random free for all? And even if you could actually have like specific classes, then are we wrong in investing in education? Like, should we be building more schools or just having people gather in some center for learning? So I think it also opens up other questions that could be problematic to answer.
I think you're absolutely spot on that. I think one of the upsides to this whole crisis is the fact that parents have realized that they have the primary responsibility of educating the child.
Yeah.
And the idea of the school was to complement what the child is learning at home. But I think with our fast-paced society, we have outsourced everything to the schools, that many parents are feeling they don't have the tools. Yes, you can buy an iPad or a laptop, but parents have lost that taste for teaching, which nature actually gives them the number one role of teaching. So I think what we are seeing right now, and I saw it in some areas such as Kitengela, where parents in a neighborhood are coming together, maybe in the community, there's an IT professor. He comes and teaches the kids programming. Maybe in the neighborhood, there's somebody who does accounting and comes and kids. And I'm just wondering, could there be some people who might be so satisfied with the outcomes of this that they might not even want to return to the traditional type of learning? Because in my neighborhood here, I'm seeing right now, I can see so many kids playing. They're having so much fun. They have so much time with their parents. Many of them only see their parents on the weekends, because of the commuting times. And I'm just wondering if an apartment complex of 80 odd residents said, you know what, we're gonna bring in, there's somebody here who is a language expert, there's somebody who's done some math, and we're gonna have sort of like a local option here for the kids of this neighborhood. And that would cut down on them being in traffic, that would cut down on them and not having enough playtime. I'm just thinking the result of that could be very significant.
Indeed, you've touched on such interesting topics. So I agree with you that probably this has made parents a bit more involved in their child's schooling. And of course, we've seen in Kenya instances where schools have tried to maintain the same level of school fees, and that's been problematic, and some have been taken to court. But then it's also brought to surface challenges in unpaid work, because, and especially for certain genders, and oftentimes mainly women. So you will find in a typical home, it's oftentimes one parent, and sadly, it's more oftentimes the female parent who bears the burden of trying to make sure that the kids can continue on with their schooling. And that has further implications on how much more that parent has to sacrifice, either waking up earlier to try and get some work done, to then catch up with the kids and help the kids go through schooling. And especially if you have younger kids who can't sit still, you often then either think of then working into 10 p.m., 11 p.m., just so that you can spend a bit of that time helping those kids do their half day via distance learning. So that's also, exacerbated some inequality, and that will also have, future implications, because, if you have one gender that can effortlessly continue with working from home with minimum disruptions and potentially even be more productive because they're not commuting, that gender will likely succeed and maybe get promoted faster, maybe end up earning more. There was a piece that was talking about in Kenya that for every 1 shilling that a man earns, women earn less than 70 cents. So that gap could become bigger. I did see a piece as well on CNN where some mothers had actually had to give up work altogether because, you have 3 kids. You are at least relying on the fact that in the US, when the fact that the kids are in school, it means, there is some sort of unofficial daycare, so you can actually do work. But now that when you're home, you don't have support from help, you're now the daycare plus the education center plus, a breadwinner. So some parents have actually just had to take a backseat and say, I will stop working just so that my kids can, forge through this. But of course, that also has, other implications in terms of the livelihood of the home, the well-being of the home, and of course the ability of the breadwinner to grow. And of course, if you're the only breadwinner, then that means further dependence on unemployment benefits, which further causes issues of employee morale. So I think we really do need to be mindful of what this working from home, studying from home means on certain breadwinners or on the dynamics within the home. But you've also raised an interesting point, which I think is important to mention. Like, because, for example, some private school teachers have been laid off, there's a possibility for exactly what you're talking about, like an estate coming together and saying, we struggle to send our kids at 6 a.m. to school. Why don't we do home-based learning and then hire these teachers to just come and teach our kids from home? On a personal note, one of my close family friends ended up doing something similar very early. When her kids were younger, she took the decision to be a stay-at-home mom and to educate her kids. What we didn't know then is that she was preparing for coronavirus 18 years earlier, right? So when all of us now were struggling to do home-based schooling and like what's going on and how do you organize this, for her, she was like, yeah, this is what we've been doing for the last 18 years. So at least now you understand, what it's all about. But yeah, I think it'd be great to see if there's some innovation around rethinking access to education and how things don't have to be traditional.
And I love how you brought up the issue of the private school teachers. And I feel in this whole discussion, they have somewhat been ignored. When you talk about education, it's been about the children, it's been about the parents, it's been about the government. And it's only until I started seeing videos going around about how one teacher up country has actually was a school owner, not even a teacher, he was a headmaster, and really has converted his school into a chicken farm. And he's doing poultry farming. And you could see he's very bitter because he said Nobody ever came to speak to him. Nobody ever came to consult him, and yet he has given his blood, sweat, and tears, really, to be able to do this. And I felt, the private school teacher really has been ignored. It's almost came as an afterthought.
Yeah.
And the government said, yes, we have come up with a 7 billion kitty. Can you ask yourself, 7 billion, how many private schools are there, in Kenya? And will that money really go to the school owners, or will it actually go to the teachers?
Correct.
It's a big issue. And that word they use, mindfulness.
Yeah.
I feel it's a word we badly needed this year.
Yeah.
Being mindful. I think we were so fixated on one area that we forgot to look at the other dimensions. And I love that word, mindfulness.
Yes, correct. And yeah, and I think the other, the unspoken word about all of this is the fact that, it's great that private schools now have gotten a bit of a bailout package from the government. And I think we forget just how important the school ecosystem or the education ecosystem is to the broader economy. So if you think of the schools that you and I went to, some of them were fortunate enough to be able to grow their own produce, so they were fairly able to source some of the raw materials internally. But then there were some things that they still needed to source from the general economy. So when schooling is closed, when they can't access that, it means suppliers can't get chicken and fruit and vegetables and rice and other things to the school. So that means, suppliers all of a sudden who had tenders and they had borrowed money to actually supply these tenders or to expand and scale their enterprises for 2020, all of that is gone. And so, already even like the bailout package isn't necessarily targeted at, it's helping to pay off some of the debts that the schools have, but it's also mainly to try and pay the teachers who've gone for very long, especially the board hired teachers. But yeah, there's a whole ripple effect when schools are closed. And it reminds me of a piece that I saw on telly where you would have, schools converting some of their facilities, either like a lab or something else, to become like a chicken rearing unit, right? Because, we don't need a lab, but, if we can raise chicken, we can earn some income to help offset with other costs. And actually in the piece that was talking about this bailout package, the one concern that schools had is, there are some fixed costs that they still need to pay. So for example, think of your secondary school that has invested in a lab. There are chemicals there, there's expensive equipment there are books there are computers and other things. So they need guards to be there 24/7. Otherwise, if the school can't afford to pay for the guards, then the computer lab will be ransacked, for example, or the audiovisual or the teacher's mess. So it's just really sad that when this decision was made, it's had such far-reaching implications, and it just seems like two arms of the government should really be trying to talk to each other: the health arms and education, and just more broadly within the government. But I know we are almost at time, so Ken, do you have any final thoughts?
I think my final thoughts would bring it closer home and ask, what's the role of we alumni within the education space? We went to these primary schools, we went to these high schools, and I, for one, I'll say I haven't spoken to anybody in my primary school. I don't know how they are faring. Well, I know they were not paying rent. I don't think they were paying rent, but still, they had to pay salaries. And how are they doing it without having students? So I think again, and that's something I was very impressed with in the States, where I saw, you'd find somebody in his 50s going for his high school reunion.
Yeah.
Somebody in his 60s going for his high school reunion. There was such a high sense of ownership. But I find it in Kenya, once you get that living certificate, it's almost as if it's been a painful experience that you don't even want to relive it. And the question is, change that conversation and start acknowledging this. Were it not for these primary schools, we would have not gone to high school. Were it not for these high schools, we would have not gone to university. So I think one challenge on my part is to call my primary school tomorrow.
Right. Please do. Yeah.
And see how they're doing,
Correct. No, I think that would be really nice. I think my parting shot would be to parents. Of course, this time has not been easy. So fully appreciate, the challenges of trying to juggle, put food on the table, and also, make sure that your kids can learn and participate in some sort of meaningful learning. So kudos and well done to all who've been able to at least provide some sort of access. It may not have been to the quality and standard that you would have liked, but I think it's appreciated, even though maybe not necessarily articulated. I think as well to teachers, the sense I have, this crisis has really probably hit you guys the hardest because your profession has more or less been put at jeopardy, and I think it sort of calls for all of the stakeholders to try and think about how to make things make sense for primary and secondary school teachers in private and public sector, and also to encourage the private sector teachers that there could be ways to rethink certain approaches, certain things about how the profession was being undertaken. I do know, for example, some teachers have resorted to offering tuition services and this and that. So I think there are ways in which innovation can come into play to help support you as you think about what this new phase of life looks like. And I think the bigger speak is to the broader stakeholders in the education system and to the health sector as well. Like, it would be great if a compromise can be reached. And I think maybe my own personal take is to try and explore and encourage folks and stakeholders that I know who are in different bits of this value chain, different bits of this ecosystem, to try and think and help add value and understand the issues at a greater detail, and to be of support where I can, because I think this education is not going away. We have children to educate ourselves. We're looking to upskill and to grow. So I think we need to find a holistic solution that covers everyone and that we support all the actors in the ecosystem, and in a fair way, not necessarily casting blame or being critical, but just trying to make sure that we're adding value and that we're considerate of our fellow man in policies and decisions being
made. Well, I think that's a good place to leave it here. Thank you so much, everybody, for us in this session. Thank you so much. Give us feedback on what you think on our social media handles. I've been seeing some comments out there which have been very encouraging. So feel free to get in touch with us. Give us some of your insights, and I'm looking forward to hosting you next week.
Yes, excellent. Thank you, Ken. See you, everyone, and looking forward to hearing from you and speaking again next week. Bye.
Bye-bye.